I'm excited to have with me today Dr. Fiery Cushman. He is a professor of psychology and director of the Moral Psychology Research Lab at Harvard University. Fiery, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Hey, thanks so much, Adam. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. So I imagine when most people think of ethics or of research on morality, they're thinking of philosophy. I'm wondering if you ever considered philosophy as an alternative career path and how you came to moral psychology specifically.
That's a great question. I'm not sure I ever considered philosophy an alternative career path, but I've long loved philosophy. In my undergraduate years, I took probably a half dozen philosophy classes. And then I was lucky when I went to graduate school, it was just as there was a kind of new little movement emerging in philosophy, especially moral philosophy, called experimental philosophy. So these were mostly a group of very young philosophers, many of them in graduate school, who thought, the questions we're asking, the way that we're asking them as philosophers could be informed by experiments on people. For instance, rather than merely considering oneself, do I think that in this situation, this is the right or wrong thing to do? I could ask whether my intuitions are reflective of what other people think. And so there was this group called the Moral Psychology Research Group that a number of these younger philosophers put together, starting probably in 2003 or so. And pretty quickly, I started attending their meetings, which were twice a year, and got a crash course in philosophy through them as well.
What do you think are some of the main differences between moral psychology and experimental moral philosophy?
Well, I mean, probably the biggest difference, it's not an absolute dividing line, but generally speaking, the psychologists are trying to just understand how ordinary people make moral judgments, without passing judgment themselves on, which is a better judgment or a worse judgment, what's the right thing to do in the end. They're just saying, as a scientific phenomenon, we see that ordinary people are able to make moral judgments, and we'd like to understand, how does that work? What is the developmental trajectory? How much does it differ across cultures? Is it shared with non-human animals? A whole host of questions like that. Experimental philosophers are interested in all the same questions that I just asked, but with a further purpose, usually, which is to help develop better normative theories to say, what in fact is right or wrong. That's not universally true. I think there are some experimental philosophers who are natural philosophers, and so that is they're using a wide set of methods, both empirical and analytical, just to try to address questions of things are, and not so much to develop a theory of the way things ought to be. But by and large, the philosophers, I think, have a next level grander ambition for what we're going to use the science for.
Quite a while ago, I did a podcast with a philosopher, Eric Schwitzgebel, and he's done a tiny bit of experimental work. And one of the standout findings to me was that moral philosophers were more likely to endorse certain things as right or wrong with stronger beliefs than your average person, but they weren't more likely to act on them. So for example, of the philosophers surveyed, they were more likely to say something like eating meat is wrong, but they were just as likely to eat meat. And it was interesting because on one hand, you could say something like, maybe they're just hypocritical. His take on that was something like, there's this sort of intellectual humility that comes along with it. So even if they're not living up to their ideal standards, they're able to articulate them and say, this is what I wish I was doing.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that work of Eric's, and he and I have teamed up a couple times over our careers, and found broadly consistent findings to the ones that you just described. But I wouldn't say that I've done enough research on those topics myself to feel like I can settle the question of would this be better described as hypocrisy or better described as, I forget the exact words that you used, but basically a kind of self-reflectiveness and humility and being able to say, well, I can both name what perfection is and also recognize that I haven't reached it. But I agree that it's powerful and interesting work.
It's a very interesting and psychological idea that we can have these sort of like split personalities, and maybe this might relate to some of your work where we talk about, you could imagine one sort of cognitive system that deals with structuring your moral values, and then you have an entirely separate, well, I'm sure there would be overlap, but a behavioral system that might not always live up to those more high level values.
Yeah, I mean, if we weren't talking about morality, then it would feel like this is a very mundane suggestion. I mean, for instance, we could say, I have the ideal work-life balance that I can understand, but I haven't yet achieved it. Mm-hmm. Or, I have the ideal amount of exercise that I would like to get, but I'm not there yet. And, I have the ideal skills as a piano player that I'd love to have, and I'm definitely never going to be there. And in any of those domains, it feels like, well, of course, that's how life works. I mean, that's the difference between an ideal and reality, but the ideal is still useful. It's something we move towards, and then it doesn't sound quite right if you say, yeah, there's like the ideal morality, but then there's what I do, which is pretty different, but I keep trying, I keep trying for the ideal. Depending on exactly how you frame it, it can sound kind of hopeful, but it can also, as you say, sound awfully hypocritical.
So this would be a good place to map out the moral landscape, to use Sam Harris's language, or to set some boundaries about what we mean by a moral problem or non-moral. Because you could make an argument that every decision you make is a moral dilemma, and that having the better work-life balance, or that getting the right exercise, eating the right diet, are all moral goods. But usually people aren't using that definition when they're talking about morality.
Yeah, I'm not sure that most people walking around have a really great definition of morality. And I am sure that as scientists, we don't have a great definition. I think one of the things that's interesting, a number of people have made this point over the years, is that within moral psychology, often people start studying morality with a very sort of impersonal, dispassionate sense of what morality is. Morality is what governs any interaction between any two people, no matter what relationship they might have. That there wouldn't be like special obligations necessarily that would come out of it being a close friend or a parent, or I'm not sure that aligns so well with the way that ordinary people think about morality. I think many ordinary people might think, look, morality almost entirely consists of my close relationships. The obligation are inherent in close relationships, and really I don't have much moral commitment to people who I don't have a close relationship with. I mean, maybe I can't harm them, but there's not much that I need to do for them. I don't know, I'm just guessing, but I will say that it would surprise me if you stop the ordinary person on the street and say, define morality. I don't think they're going to do a very good job. The way that if you said, define a bachelor, I think they'd probably be able to say an unmarried man.
Right. Do most people tend to have a conception of morality that's sort of akin to a natural law? So it might be something like the moral truths are out there, we just might not know them, as opposed to thinking something like a more moral relativist approach, where it's like maybe everything depends on the context and there are no objective answers.
Yeah, there's been a lot of great research on this. Jeff Goodwin has done some, Leanne Young recently has done some, and myself, I haven't studied that question much, but my understanding of what the literature tells us is that people are flexible in adopting either sort of what you might call absolutist or relativist positions. And a lot of it depends on what they see around them. So there are certain things like, is it okay to neglect your child? Is it okay to harm innocent people? Where there's really uniform opinion on these questions. People do not see a lot of debate. And in those cases, they tend to view those as moral absolutes, that it's something independent of human psychology or the human mind that makes those things right or wrong. And then there's other sorts of things like, to choose an obvious example, different religious traditions make very different demands on the people who of those religions. And people see that diversity and they say, well, I have a relatively more relativist attitude about that. It seems to me that just like, people have different tastes, people might have different moral commitments depending on their upbringing. And it's sort of, relative to their religion or their culture or their experience. That's a true moral commitment, but it's not a universal one and it's not an absolute one.
Are there any?
There's a sense in which those obviously, those are contradictory views. It feels like, well, wait a minute, which is it? But I think that, when you study human psychology, we're full of contradictory views. Humans do not walk around with single coherent, all-encompassing theories worked out. That's just not, that's just not how we do it.
Yeah, I'm wondering if evolutionary psychology might shed light on some of those contradictions, especially if there's any bias in a particular direction. Like kin selection could be one example of a theory that might explain something. Like, why is it typically viewed as worse to harm your own child than a random child? They're both human children, but then I guess the evolutionary explanation would be something like you're going to be more biased towards protecting your own lineage.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it kind of cuts both ways. On the one hand, you could say, oh, yes, from the standpoint of kin selection, it makes a great deal of sense that people would be interested in the welfare of their children. But then an interesting question is, well, if they're already interested in the welfare of their children, why does it need to be a moral concern? Let me say, for instance, it's easy from an evolutionary standpoint to understand why people get hungry and eat. But we generally don't think that people have a moral obligation to eat. We just, and precisely because we get hungry and therefore want to eat, that's already sufficient reason. We don't need it, we don't need third parties enforcing eating. We've got hunger. Well, why do we need third parties enforcing care for children? We have love, we have parental instincts. So one possibility is to say, well, the key difference here is just that one is interpersonal and the other is intrapersonal. I get hungry for myself, but I feel love towards others. And as soon as I have attitudes towards other people, now we're within the moral domain. That's possible, but there seem to be counterexamples to that. For instance, if you're in love with somebody and you're dating them, does that mean that you have a moral commitment? And it might be that because you're dating, there's certain obligations that you have, moral commitments to each other. But it would feel strange to say you're morally obligated to be in love with another person. So it seems like just adding the ingredient of it being an interpersonal relationship isn't going to be sufficient. So then why would the general community think it's not just a private matter that you care for your children, and it's insufficient that evolution has built in you parental instincts? It's also going to be the case that we insist that it's going to be punishable or sanctionable if you don't take care of your children. I don't know. I don't have a good answer to that question.
Yeah. I'd like to take a detour into game theory to maybe get at this interpersonal explanation. So tit for tat is probably the best example of this. For our listeners, you could imagine some sort of trading game where you could choose to cooperate with a partner or not cooperate. And if you both cooperate, you both get a small reward. If you don't cooperate and your partner does, you get a larger reward and they get nothing. And if neither of you cooperate, you both get nothing, or maybe there would both be some negative reward. But in either case, your payoff is bigger if you don't cooperate compared to if you do. So why cooperate? And it seems like if you're doing this just once, then you're incentivized to screw over your partner. But if you're doing this over potentially thousands of repeated trials, you get cooperation as sort of this emergent, efficient strategy. And you see that in evolutionary game theory as well. So I'm wondering if, because it looks awfully moral, right? If you have, let's say, an AI playing this trading game and it learns to cooperate, it seems like we could look at it and say it's learning to be moral, to behave cooperatively, but it's really just picking the most efficient solution. So I'm wondering if our sense of cooperation or of morality might sort of emerge ground up from something that is already just a mathematically optimal solution to some sort of large-scale trading game.
Yeah, I mean, I think many people since Trevor's seminal paper on reciprocal altruism have had the thought, oh, maybe this is a kind of game theoretic foundation for morality. And there's something fundamentally right about that. I mean, I think in many cases, you can look at whether it's the two-player prisoner's dilemma that you sketched out, or the public goods game, which is a kind of n-player generalization, that a lot of the moral attitudes that we have can be captured well by those sorts of games. But I also want to point out that there's many ways in which contemporary moral standards, for instance, in the United States, require us to actually actively work against tit for tat. So here's an example. Suppose I run a small business and I have 5 employees, and things went really well in the business this year. We made a bunch of extra money. And some of the employees have been, working harder, and some of them haven't been working as hard. But one of the ones that hasn't been working so hard, let me use his vacation home for 3 weeks last summer. And so I give a huge bonus to that one. That's tit for tat, right? He did me a favor, and so I'm doing him a favor. But that's also corruption. and if you think about it, the same could be true for government officials or for an interaction with a police officer. How about I pay you $20 and this ticket goes away? On a certain construal, that's tit for tat. Mm-hmm. Often, especially when we're thinking about institutions, so a business is an institution, a government is an institution, the institutions are designed to mandate impartiality precisely to avoid reciprocal altruism. Mm-hmm. Because thoroughgoing reciprocal altruism that infects institutional structures is another word for corruption.
Mm-hmm. So that's an almost optimistic take on corruption, because it seems to suggest that we might still have that baseline desire for reciprocal altruism, but that the problems happen when it's almost like you're exchanging different currencies. So for example,
exactly. Yeah. I mean, you might be familiar with some of Alan Fiske's theorizing about different types of exchange relationships that we can have. And he doesn't really talk about impartiality in institutional structures, but one of his levels is market exchange, where we say, it's a free and open market, like I give you money for services. But that, as you say, and then another one of his is reciprocal altruism, like, we go to the pub each week and I buy you the beer this week and you buy me the beer next week. And you can think about those as kinds of different social currencies that don't really mix. And so I'm not exactly sure where institutional structures would fit into his framework, but they would seem to reside somewhat closer to the market exchange, where there's sort of permissible ways that we're allowed to exchange goods and services, and there's impermissible woways, and I scratch your back if you scratch mine actually doesn't work in that arena, or would be considered immoral in that arena.
Right. So I'm guessing that once you start to sketch out these impermissible set of actions or these immoral actions, that's where you need some way of enforcing it, and that's where this idea of moral punishment would come in.
Yes, that's right. So, I mean, it is interesting. I've spent a lot of time studying punishment, but as a researcher who studies punishment, we're often doing that by creating these very contrived economic games, like the prisoner's dilemma or public goods game, or by writing vignettes where we say, okay, imagine somebody, stole money from somebody else. How much should they be punished? Full stop. But we don't say anything about who's doing the punishing or how they're doing the punishing. And so then you kind of want to pause and say, what am I studying? If I construct a public goods game with a punishment round, what is the thing in the real world that's like? What's the quote unquote punishment round in the real world? Mm-hmm. If I say to somebody, Bob stole money, should he be punished? Who's doing that punishing? And the answer, as far as I can tell, is that the great majority of true costly punishment, not just snarky words, but like an actual punishment where you're imposing a cost on somebody, the great majority of it is either through institutions like the criminal justice system, or, corporations might have sanctions for employees who do things that are wrong, or parent-child relationships. But, here I am, for instance, in the psychology department. I'd be hard-pressed to think of anything that anybody in this community could do, since I'm not the chair of the department, that would make me punish them. I could have a colleague steal my sandwich from the fridge, but I'm not going to punch them or something? I mean, what am I going to do? Steal something from them? No, basically just angry words. And then I go home and I'm spending time with my family or my friends. Again, other than my children, I have 2 young children. So if they do something really wrong, then they have to sit in timeout. But beyond those institutional and parenting settings, there's very, very little punishment that actually occurs, right. at least in my life. I mean, but maybe in other cultures and other historical time periods or whatever, the punishment has been more common, but I'm not sure.
Right. Yeah. And then if there are repeated infractions like that, let's say a colleague is stealing your lunch every single day. At a certain point, you'll confront them directly, but let's say they just ignore your words and keep doing it. It seems like you have only 2 options. One is resort to physical violence, which you probably wouldn't do, or you would have to sort of tattle on some sort of higher authority, like the institution, like you mentioned.
That's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or recruit a coalition, try to ostracize the person, or just withdraw from the situation oneself. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And the idea of having institutions with the power to punish is interesting, because there's this sort of impartiality about it. Like, the idea is we have a agreed upon set of rules, and if you cross those rules, there are going to be these punishments that are also agreed upon. So then you don't wind up in a sort of, let's say you punish someone and then they punish you back twice as hard, and you kind of wind up in this, what's the term for it, where it snowballs into where everyone's getting revenge on everyone.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the classic examples of those are blood feuds. If you look in cultures of honor around the world and across history, you find that cultures of honor tend to, you probably know this, but the classic culture of honor is a kind of social organization where people are arranged into close-knit, usually family-based clans, and the men in the clan are charged with defending its resources through extreme retaliatory violence directed at anybody who insults them, steals resources, harms their family, and so on. And what you find in cultures of honor are these cycles of revenge where, take the Hatfields and the McCoys. I think it started with somebody being accused of stealing somebody else's pig. The person who supposedly stole the pig got shot. Then that person got, the person who did the shooting got shot. Then the brother of the person who did the shooting got shot. And 20 years later, I think, something like a dozen people had been killed in the conflict. Mm-hmm. Those cultures of honor tend to arise in the absence of state level institutions. And the advantage of a state level institution, this is an argument that, for instance, Steve Pinker describes in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, is that it can sever the cycle of violence by saying, like, look, the state itself is so powerful that when it puts the pig thief in jail, there's nobody you can shoot. You know, it would be suicide to start a war against the state. So you're just going to have to deal with it. And then the other family doesn't need, you know, you by using the state to get their revenge, basically, they don't need to get involved in violence at the family level.
Right. So this brings up an idea about moral progress, whether such a thing exists, because it sounds like the state-based format you just laid out seems like an improvement over sort of the clans feuding, but I'm sure there's a whole camp of people to say something like, there are different moral systems, but we can't necessarily say one is better and one is worse. They're just suited for different environments.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that you can do is kind of separate out the argument into two parts. So we can say, with respect to some type of yardstick for what we want, then once we have agreed on the yardstick, we can ask, what are different forms of social organization that maximize on that yardstick? So, you know, if your yardstick was, let's try to minimize the number of lives lost due to interpersonal violence, and your choices were either let's have a culture of honor, or, and this is going to be an important stipulation, let's have a well-functioning state. So by well-functioning state, what we mean is that whatever the state's criminal justice apparatus is, it hasn't been captured by some faction to be used as a cudgel to exert their own power and control at cost to others, right? But if we had a well-functioning state, then I think most people would that well-functioning state is going to do better on the fewer lives lost to interpersonal violence yardstick than the culture of honor will. You know, the difficulty is, of course, if the criminal justice system is captured. So let's, you know, take an example of, for instance, a totalitarian regime or an authoritarian regime where the police force becomes a tool of a ruling minority in order to exert control and extract resources from everybody else. You know, nominally, I mean, it's certainly a state and it's certainly a police force, and it might be able to stop retaliatory cycles of violence that would otherwise emerge, but it introduces its own problems.
Right. So there's this constant tug of war between needing sort of a police state powerful enough to subdue any violence or uprisings and crime, but then also not to be so tyrannical to just to be corrupted by those people in power.
Yeah. And then, of course, there's the question, you know, what alternative forms of social organization are able to diffuse human conflicts, not through the exercise or threat of violence. I mean, if that was like one potential way to understand a police force is it's designed to diffuse human conflict, to create less harm, less suffering. And it does that because ultimately there's the threat of violence. You know, hopefully it doesn't have to be used, but, you know, let's take a very contrived and silly example. Two people are engaged in a fist fight on the street. The officer walks up. He has his gun holstered. He doesn't have to use his gun, but the threat of the gun there is what ends the fight. You know what I mean? And then you can ask yourself, well, I don't know. I mean, if two people are fighting on the street, what other ways do we have to end that fight that don't involve the threat of violence? But at this point, we are well beyond my area of expertise.
Yeah. All right. Well, I want to bring up one more question sort of off the deep end. It reminds me of one of Nietzsche's ideas. The basic idea is something like, in order to be morally good, you have to have some sort of strength or some capacity for evil. Otherwise, so for example, if you're a nonviolent person and you're nonviolent simply because you're weak, then you don't necessarily have the same claim to moral virtue as someone who could be very violent, but controls themselves. So the idea is, if you have these sort of violent fantasies inside your head, you're probably not a good person just because you don't act them out. You're probably a good person only if you don't have those fantasies to begin with.
Mm. Interesting. You know, I've never read Nietzsche, but I think that that's one of the most concise and illuminating summaries that I've heard. So thanks. And now you've made me curious. You've whet my appetite to read more. But it's not an area of philosophy that I know anything about.
Yeah. Do you think it might tie into some of the moral psychology research either that you've done or that you're familiar with? So I guess the hypothesis here would be that you might have individual differences in temperament, and we might be inclined to think something like more agreeable people are better because they're gonna, from a moral perspective, because they'll engage in less conflict. But this idea would say something like, just because you're agreeable doesn't mean you're good. And it would also say something like, if you're disagreeable, even if you're the type to engage in conflict, maybe you could sort of fuel that into something like what a police officer's role might supposed to be. So you're still being violent, I guess, but you're doing it against criminals for some greater good rather than against innocents.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. I mean, in a way, it reminds me of this thing that Kant says in the beginning of the groundwork, where he says, like, imagine two people, one of whom is just disposed to be generous, but the other of whom acts generously out of duty. He claims the second person, the one who acts generously out of duty, is the morally superior person. My sense is that the best current research that we have suggests that whether Kant was right or wrong, he did not share the common view of ordinary people. That is, your ordinary person on the street thinks, actually, I rather prefer the person who's just instinctively generous to the person who has to act generously out of duty. There's a long line of research that David Pizarro engaged in on these topics, and more recently, Molly Crockett and Jim Everett, and I think Clayton Critcher. A number of people have looked at this question. Do we like people whose morally virtuous behavior is relatively more spontaneous or relatively more deliberative? So in both cases, they do the same thing. You know, both people gave $100 to charity, or both people saved, somebody from drowning in the river. In general, the finding is we like the people who do those things spontaneously rather than the people who do those things deliberatively. Now, how might that apply to the cases that you were describing motivated by Nietzsche? So say, for instance, we have someone who never acts violently because they don't want to act violently. And we have another person who keeps having these violent impulses but suppresses them. So following Kant, you might have thought, well, wait a minute, that second person is really showing great strength of will, doing things out of duty. It's not just the luck of the draw that they happen to never have the impulses in the first place. But my sense, even though perhaps this precise question hasn't been asked in the literature, but my sense from all the folks who I just mentioned is that the direction the literature is pointing is that people would feel relatively more comfortable and give greater moral credit to the person who just doesn't even have the violent impulses in the first place.
Yeah, when you were sketching out those two different behavior patterns, I was imagining I would want to be surrounded by the types of people who are sort of a straight edge morally that you can count on. But in terms of giving moral credit to any particular action, it seems like there's something like more praiseworthy about the spontaneous moral action that you're not expecting. Because it's like, if someone's a good person and they continue doing good deeds, it's like, great. But also it's because it's expected. It's almost like you give them less credit.
Yeah. I want to say that David Pizarro ran a study very much like that. I might have the details wrong, but as I remember it, I think he ran a study where he used the trolley problem,
Mhm.
And he got people to agree in a certain sort of case, maybe something like pushing somebody in front of a train to stop it from hitting 5 other people, that might be the morally best thing to do. But despite their agreeing that it might have been the morally best thing to do, they really would rather have like affiliate with a person who couldn't bring themselves to do it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that makes sense. I mean, in the same way, you could say like, maybe it's a hero in war who is able to unflinchingly kill many of the enemy when the situation demands it. And we're glad for her heroism. But at the end of the day, we'd rather date her sister, whatever, you get the idea.
Uh-huh. Yeah. So to dial it back to some of your work on punishment, we were talking about punishment either enacted by individuals or by some state that you give power to. Is that to say that at least in the US, that most people, when asked about punishment, have strong beliefs about maybe certain people should be punished for certain things, but then it's like, but I don't want to be the one having to do the punishment?
Yeah, that's a great question. My guess is that that's true. Most people themselves don't want to be the ones, are glad that the state is available to punish for them. And it makes me wonder, I think there's been a lot of commentary about whether there are ways in which the degree or kind of punishment that occurs can sometimes get out of proportion to the offense itself. Certainly if we were to look across countries, there's a great deal of variability, things that certain countries punish extremely severely, other countries punish much less. How is it that it might happen that punishments would get out of whack with the underlying offense? Well, one possibility is that in the absence of a really strong state, where punishment is risky and hard and painful and severs social relationships, it would be used very sparingly. But when the state becomes powerful, then we have the ability to throw relatively arbitrary degrees of punishment at people without having to fear any recourse. And so that could kind of lead to an imbalance. I'm also thinking here of some recent research done by Reagan Bernhard, who was at the time a postdoc in my lab. And this is unpublished work, but she's just putting together the papers now, where she looks at what sorts of punishments we deem acceptable and why. So, in the United States, most people feel that it would be wrong to torture somebody. Really awful torture. If you were if they were being, if they had committed a crime and were being punished. On the other hand, if you think about what it's like to be sent to certain prisons in the United States, on its face, all that we're doing is depriving you of your liberty. But in reality, what's happening in the prisons amounts to torture. And people understand that, and yet are being, people continue to send convicts to prison. He tried to understand what it is that really drives people's intuitions about which punishments are acceptable and which punishments are unacceptable. And perhaps surprisingly, what she finds is that for ordinary people, they view punishments as unacceptable when they feel as if to actually do those things to somebody themselves would be very hard for them to do. Much more than because they're imagining the suffering of the person who undergoes those experiences. Let me give you 2 examples here. Say, one form of torture might be giving someone a pill that causes them pain that's a 10 out of 10 on a pain scale. And another form of torture might be stabbing them with a needle that gives them pain that's a 5 out of 10. And the basic upshot of Reagan's work is that she finds that people think maybe as a punishment, it's okay to give the pill, but not to use the needle.
Yeah.
And that's hard to explain if what they're fundamentally concerned with is the suffering of the person who undergoes the torture, because of course, by stipulation, the torture was twice as bad in the case of the pill as in the case of the needle. And yet, if you had to imagine yourself saying, okay, here's the pill, now take it, it doesn't feel like something that's hard to imagine, or that would be hard to make yourself do. But if you have to imagine yourself sticking a pin in somebody, it's actually really hard to imagine. It feels like something it would be very hard to bring yourself to do.
That's very interesting. It seems to explain another example I was wondering about in my mind. So like, if we imagine two different punishments for a crime, one is something like 10 years in prison and the other is you get a finger chopped off. It seems like even though the 10 years in prison might be more overall suffering, there's something about the finger that seems very cruel and unusual. And we send people to prison for many years all the time. So, but that seems to explain it, because it must be much harder to chop someone's finger off yourself than to send them to prison, which is sort of this more whole bureaucratic seeming thing, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how about the severity of punishments? So, for example, we could say that if every law-breaking violation had a severe punishment, like again, maybe you get a finger chopped off or something, that would, on one hand, be extremely cruel and tyrannical of the state, but on the other hand, probably have very low crime rates. But we have this like moral conception of, even if it would be super, if it would work very well, that we shouldn't do that. Where do you think the we shouldn't do that comes from? Because it's almost like we have this conception of what the ideal state should look like implicitly mapped out.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there was a researcher, Kevin Carlsmith, who died tragically of cancer at quite a young age, but along with John Darley and others, he ran a whole series of studies trying to understand what motivates people to punish. And in the philosophical literature, there's two dominant positions here. So there are consequentialist theories, which basically say the reason that we punish is to prevent future crime, to prevent future harm. And that can work in several ways. If you put someone in prison and they're violent, for instance, well, then you have a violent person off the streets. So that's going to lead to less harm. You're incapacitating them. It could be that when the person's released from prison, they've learned their lesson and they're not going to do it again. That specific individual won't recidivate. So less crime. It could be that other people see the example and therefore prevent themselves from committing crimes. That's, sometimes called general deterrence. So that's they differ in their details, but generally speaking, these are theories according to which we're thinking, how can I punish in a way that will minimize future harm? Consequentialist. Alternative set of theories, retributive theories, say there's something more like, forgive the language, like a cosmic imbalance, like someone's been harmed and we set the balance sheet right when we get revenge, when we make the harm doer experience harm themselves. What Carlsmith found is that if you ask people to explain why they punish, they think both of these ideas are good and important. They think that punishment does prevent future crime, and that's a good reason to punish people. And they also think that if someone has harmed other people, they deserve to be harmed themselves, and that's like just part of justice in the universe, that you have to set that balance sheet right. That's what they say. But then if you construct vignettes, little case studies, and say, okay, in this situation, John Doe did the following things, you could send him to prison for a month, 6 months, a year, life, whatever. The judgments that they make seem to be far better explained by a retributive theory than by any of the consequentialist theories. So for instance, on a consequentialist theory, and this is coming now to the heart of your question, if there's a crime that is extremely difficult to detect, then we should punish it much more severely. So say, for instance, in state A, you almost never catch anyone speeding. And in state B, you always catch them speeding. Then in state B, if you catch someone speeding, just give them a $50 ticket. State A, if you catch someone speeding, maybe send them to prison for 5 years, because it's going to take a huge amount of penalty to convince people don't speed if the risk of getting caught is super low. Because, you know, what is the expected value of speeding? It's the severity of the penalty times the probability of you're getting caught. But people don't make moral judgments like that at all. Nobody thinks that the likelihood of getting caught really bears on the question, how much should, you know, how big should how severe should the penalty be? Instead, just as you anticipated, they tend to think, well, basically the severity of the penalty should scale with the magnitude of the harm that you caused as a criminal. So you asked, where do those intuitions come from? I mean, there's some interesting evolutionary psychology that's been done on that question. And intuitively, it makes sense that if, in order to punish basically, if punishing a person is a costly act, then and the more severely you want to punish them, the more costly it is, then you want to use the minimum amount of punishment you can to disincentivize the behavior that they're engaging in. And one might think that, roughly speaking, that would mean proportionality.
Right. So does expected value or expected punishment really not play a role in governing moral decision making? Because I would have assumed that, you know, people are worst off when they can get away with it. If you set the threshold of punishment to 0, then everyone's gonna, you know, society will be chaos.
I mean, you're asking big and complicated questions. So
that's the fun part of this podcast.
Yeah, no, well, that is the fun part. Yeah, but I would say it's a bit outside of my own wheelhouse. I've done a lot of research on how ordinary people think about punishment, but I can't claim to have any expertise on the necessity of punishment for a well-functioning society.
Yeah. Okay, so to turn more to your own research, one of the things I was most interested reading about is this idea of moral luck. Maybe you could sketch out an example of that and we could talk about it.
Yeah, one of the examples that has been most influential in my thinking is just about a couple of folks who engage in drunk driving. You know, maybe they go to the bar, they have a few too many together, and they both drive home. One runs off the road and runs into a tree, and the other runs off the road and runs into a person. And they could expect, in most states in the United States, very, very different punishments. The one who runs into a tree, you know, I mean, they might lose their license or have their license suspended. They'd probably have a monetary fine. But the one who runs into a person is probably going to spend time in prison. And so those are really, really very different outcomes. And on its face, I mean, at least as I've constructed the scenario, you might think that their conduct is identical. I mean, suppose that they fall asleep at the wheel. So it's not that one of them saw that there was only a tree and the other one saw that there was only a person. It's just two people who had too much to drink and they fell asleep at the wheel.
Right.
And so our lab has spent a lot of time trying to just document, I mean, as I've framed it so far, that's just, does that actually characterize the way that ordinary people make moral judgments? And we found that it does. We find that moral judgments look this way to a very, very young age. So it doesn't look like the moral judgments are being driven by knowledge of the laws, you know, because a 4-year-old shows basically, we don't use drunk driving with the 4-year-olds, but you construct a relevantly similar case and the 4-year-olds will judge it just the same. And then we also find, and this was the kind of unexpected, but shaped a lot of our thinking about moral luck, that this thing that I've just described is definitely a property of the way that people think about punishment. They think that the person who killed somebody should be punished more than the person who ran into the tree. But it doesn't change their judgments of those people's characters differentially. That is, they don't think the person who ran into the girl or the pedestrian is a worse person. They just think they should be punished more. Right. And it doesn't change their judgments about how wrongful the behavior was. They don't say that, like, the second drunk driver acted more wrongfully than the first. I say, no, they engaged in equally wrongful behavior that happened to have different consequences that therefore merit very different degrees of punishment.
Mm-hmm. What's the justification for the punishing more purely based on that bad luck outcome?
Well, yeah, it depends, but on what you mean by justification. I mean, we find that ordinary people don't really have a great justification ready at hand, other than appealing, broadly speaking, to this idea of kind of restoring the cosmic balance. Mm-hmm. Philosophers have tried, some philosophers have tried to justify this phenomenon of moral luck, and other ones have tried to argue against it and say, no, it shouldn't be justified. It's a mistake. As psychologists, we're trying to understand, well, we're using justification in a different sense, a kind of descriptive scientific sense. We don't mean a moral justification. We mean like, why is the mind designed that way? Can we make sense out of it? Mm-hmm. And one argument that we've made, and this has helped to shape a lot of our subsequent research, is that maybe part of the explanation has to do with the role that punishment plays in teaching people appropriate standards of behavior. Mm-hmm. So the thought that we had was by punishing more when harm occurs, we're sending an unambiguous message that at the end of the day, the thing we don't want is harm. That you have to look out and not harm other people. Mm-hmm. Let me use a kind of, it might seem trite, but a much more everyday example that I think drives this home. When we had very young children, dinner time was a total mess. They would spill things. Now, suppose that they're, shaking their sippy cup, and one day it happens to be empty, and so nothing spills out. And we might say, oh, please don't shake your cup at the table. And another day, the lid is loose and it's totally full. And as soon as they shake it, milk everywhere. And we might get quite a bit more frustrated and say, Sally, what are you doing? You can't spill the milk like that. So those are different responses. It's total chance from the perspective of the child. It's not that the child was doing something worse or less bad one day versus the other. It's just an accident. But they're teachable moments. Like by having those different responses, we're providing the child with important information, not just don't shake the cup, but also the particular reason not to shake the cup is we don't want the milk everywhere. Right. And that's going to help them generalize. It's going to tell them, well, if my milk was in a bowl, I shouldn't tip it over, or if it's a salt shaker, it's okay to shake it. It's not that nothing can be shook at the table. It's that we have to pay attention to what's inside of the things we're shaking. Right. So yeah, that's one of the ways that we've been thinking about moral luck.
Yeah, oddly enough, it seems like you actually need the bad outcome to have that fully teachable moment. Because you could imagine in the drunk driving example, let's say there's only the person who hit the tree, and you could send them to jail for years, and as if they just killed a person, and say it's almost like a counterfactual punishment. Like this could have happened, so we're going to punish you based on the worst case scenario. People would seem to be morally outraged by that rather than understanding the whole teaching lesson. But then if something bad actually happens, it seems like we take it to heart more.
That's right. So it turns out that in philosophy and in legal studies, there's an idea called expedience, the idea that an important function of punishment is to express our moral attitudes. And in our recent psychological work, we've been thinking, maybe there's something really right about that. And can we understand the structure of human punishment largely through the functional lens of its being a tool to express what is right and wrong, what is valuable and not valuable.
Mm-hmm. Right. So we've been talking about punishment mostly from like a more societal level, like hardcore punishment. But there's also forms of punishment, like something as simple as making a derogatory comment on someone. And I'm wondering how this relates to the idea of virtue signaling. Like if we ever go out of our way to have these sort of low-level punishments, not because anything that someone else did is wrong, but specifically to signal something like some level of moral superiority, the fact that you're able to make that sort of comment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Julian Jordan at the Harvard Business School has done a lot of work, and as of others, Rob Kurzban, Peter Discioli, arguing that often punishing a third party. So what they mean by that is, John and Phil were in some altercation. I had nothing to do with it, but I'm now going to come in and punish John or punish Phil. So I'm a third party coming in and punishing. That often that type of third party punishment is actually designed to express my moral values to people who are watching me. So for instance, maybe I'm standing by the subway station and I see somebody taking money out of a blind homeless person's guitar case, or like a blind busker is playing guitar for money and someone's stealing money. And then I go over and say, how dare you do that? And grab the money back and throw it in and call the police, whatever it might be. Mm-hmm. The analysis is, well, maybe I'm doing that principally because there's an audience of other people in the subway around me. And they're thinking, now here's a really virtuous guy. Mm-hmm. And I don't think there's anyone who thinks that that's the only explanation for third-party punishment. But there's a great deal of evidence by the folks I just mentioned and others that it's an important part of what third-party punishment is about. Mm-hmm. And recently, there's been a number of psychologists who've started to think about online spaces mm-hmm. in this way. Some of the vitriol in online communities being people who are, dunking on somebody, not because they're trying to fix, so person A tweets something, person B says, you're the biggest moron I've ever met, go home. Mm-hmm. Person B isn't trying to convince person A. They're not trying to solve the problem that person A created. Part of what person B is doing is announcing to everybody else on Twitter, hey, here's my moral values. But one can't help but feel that comes at a bit of a cost in terms of the environment that it creates.
So I guess you would say that the degree to which that status signaling plays a role in your behavior might be explained by to what degree your behavior is different when other people are looking versus not. So there's like
right.
That,
I mean, that, yeah.
Yeah.
Like I think it was Kurzban and Discioli had one of the very earliest papers of this kind where they basically showed third-party punishment is a lot more likely when people are watching.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I guess that could relate to moral behavior even more generally, because we're all told from a young age, like, do good even when no one is watching. But then it also seems like we all have this intuition that it matters when people are watching.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's still the case that people do all sorts of wonderful things when no one is watching. And to the extent that being watched draws out still better behavior or behavior more consistently, I think there's a hopeful take on that, which is that, hey, let's use that power to have people watched, I suppose, in the right way, in the right circumstances, that draws out their best behavior. A way of phrasing that is like cultures of transparency and openness are going to be ones that foster our best instincts in some cases. There's obviously going to be limits to that, but it's just, I guess what I'm trying to emphasize is sometimes things that at first when you say them can feel a little cynical. Once you start viewing them as instruments that are under our control, they can help us to create the societies that we want.
Do you know anything about research on conscience or guilt? So that would be like internalizing this sort of watchful society belief. So like,
yeah, that's a very common idea. There's a number of researchers have distinguished between guilt and shame, and they're kind of defining the words in a way that's useful for their theorizing. But they'll define them so that shame is an emotional experience that's about other people seeing you and having an attitude about you. But guilt is a kind of, as you say, private and internalized emotional experience, where instead of being concerned about what other people think of you, you feel that you've fallen short of your own standards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And a lot of folks have argued that for that reason, guilt is, in some sense, the preferable of those two emotions.
Yeah. Relatedly, my friend and I, a while ago, were debating about the difference between shame and embarrassment. And the conclusion we came to was that shame seems to be very similar to embarrassment, except it has this quality of moral wrongness, or embarrassment seems to have some like innocence to it.
Yeah, or I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with Susan Fisk's distinction between warmth and competence as two fundamental dimensions of person perception. So she says a lot of the way that we understand other people can be broken down to they have some degree of warmth, and you might think of that as similar to like their moral quality, and some degree of competence, like their ability to get things done, basically. And it feels to me like embarrassment operates mostly on the competence dimension. Whereas shame is operating much more on the warmth dimension.
That makes a lot of sense. So I'd like to wrap up by asking you about some of your ongoing and future work in the lab. Is there anything that you'd be most excited to share?
Oh, gosh. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's been a lot of fun for me recently is some work that my postdoc, Sydney Levine, has been doing. And this is also in collaboration with Laura Schultz and Josh Tenenbaum and others. But Sydney has been arguing that an important but kind of neglected part of our moral psychology is our tendency to judge whether an action is right or wrong by asking what would happen if that action were universalized. Mm-hmm. So let me give you an example. My current home is on a very busy road, and it's about 4 doors down from a traffic light. Okay. At the traffic light, one cannot make a left-hand turn because it would cause a huge traffic jam, because you'd have to stop all this oncoming traffic and wait and wait and wait. And yet, and so if anyone tries to make a left-hand turn at their traffic light, you're going to get honked at. Like everyone thinks that's wrong. But if I make a left-hand turn into my driveway, nobody has a problem with that. And if it takes 40 seconds before there's a break in the traffic and I can go, the people behind me don't seem to get exasperated by that at all. They're not honking at me. Presumably because the principle, somebody who lives on Fresh Pond Parkway can turn left into their driveway, can be universalized. Like all of us could live by that principle. And Fresh Pond Parkway would be just fine. Yeah. But if we had the general principle, anybody who needs to turn left at Huron Avenue can pull into the middle of the intersection and stop for 40 seconds until there's a break in traffic. If you universalize that principle, it would be a permanent traffic jam because there were constantly such people who need to do that rather than just me and a few other people who need to get into their driveways. So anyway, that illustrates this basic idea that sometimes whether a specific action is right or wrong can be judged by considering its sort of universal consequences. There's a lot of ways in which this is a powerful idea, but one of the things that to me is most fun about it is that ever since 2 seminal important field-changing papers right around 2001, one by Jonathan Haidt and one by Josh Green, the field of moral psychology has been very concerned with automatic, emotional, intuitive mechanisms for making moral judgments. And the kinds of deliberative, rational, thoughtful mechanisms of making moral judgment, the kind that, for instance, Kant really argued for, have been a bit out of fashion. And I think Sydney has put her finger on a way in which Kant had at least one piece of the puzzle right. This is not to say that it overturns any of Jonathan Haidt's ideas, but just that it kind of restores to the literature something with a little bit more of a rationalist flavor. So that's been fun just because it's been something new and different and unexpected.
Yeah, that is very interesting. So right, the universalist idea, behave as if all of your actions could be universalist. That's a Kantian idea.
Yeah, I mean, Kant famously argued a few different ways that one could think about making moral decisions that roughly have that flavor. Sydney in her work has done a really nice job of working out some of the details of how ordinary people seem to think about universalization. And they differ ever so slightly from Kant's formulation. They look a little bit more like some 20th century philosophers, like Singer, not Peter Singer. But fundamentally, it's a very Kantian idea. Yeah.
It seems like it also blends well with evolutionary theory, because you have some phenomena like psychopaths seem to emerge in any population up to like 2 to 3% of the population, and it's like if it's a lower number than that, then there's sort of this niche, and there's people, I guess, waiting to be taken advantage of. Not that it's a good thing, but it happens.
Right.
And if you apply that logic of if everyone behaved like this, then it just wouldn't work. So it seems related to this idea of these evolutionary equilibria.
Yeah, balancing selection. Yeah, that's an interesting connection. I hadn't thought about it in that light. But that's some of what Sydney is doing right now, is trying to think of the connections between universalization and evolutionary game theory.
Very interesting. Thank you for sharing. Is there anything else you want to talk about today?
Gosh, no, it feels like we covered a lot of ground, but this has been a total delight. Thank you so much for having me.
We did. It was a great conversation. Thank you so much for your time, Fiery.
Yeah.